To settle down before we start. Yeah, all right. Dear colleagues and friends, I welcome you to the closing session of the G20 Summit series of the Ananta Center, the stop at New Delhi between Bali and Rio. The format of this panel discussion is a 40-minute dialogue, post which the floor will be open to questions. Brief housekeeping announcements. Please keep your phones on silent and the mics at the tables turned off unless recognized for Q&As. Mics will also be passed around to you when the Q&A begins. It is a request that you keep your questions brief. I'm pleased also to introduce our moderator, Richa Kumaria, Program Executive at the Ananta Center. Richa is an MSc International Relations graduate from the London School of Economics and looks at India's climate and energy policies. Thank you, everyone. I hand over the proceedings.
Thank you, Vidul. A very good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the culminating session of Ananta's G20 Summit series. As we have a widely popular and, if I may add, a slightly unexpected leader's declaration, today's discussion will focus on some of the key takeaways from the presidency and how Brazil's forthcoming presidency will take this forward. To discuss this, we have a very distinguished panel with us. May I please welcome Ms. Enam Gambhir, who is a Joint Secretary of the G20 Secretariat at the Ministry of External Affairs and an Ananta KBF Fellow, Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha, who heads the Non-Traditional Security Center at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, and Dr. Rudra Chaudhary, who is the Director of Carnegie India. Thank you for joining us today. Enam, we know that you were, of course, an integral part of the G20 process. So let's begin with your perspective on how India has reshaped the global G20 agenda.
Thank you very much. Thank you also to Ananta Center for inviting me. Very happy to be here. How much time do I have for this question?
Roughly 2 to 3 minutes.
Okay, thanks. So I'll just make 2 points then, broadly in terms of answering this, again, a broad question. I think it's very important to see in answering the question, how has India shaped the G20 agenda in the context of how did we arrive at this point when we took over the presidency, and how are we passing it on in terms of the standing of this grouping and the impact that it has achieved and it can achieve. Now, I think, I'll come to the consensus part also later, because I think that's also very, very fundamental. But I think one thing which is extremely important to say, India being the second developing country, having taken over in this 4-year span that we are going to see in the G20 process, which is not very usual, where we had sort of started seeing the Global South's priorities and ambition come to the forefront of the agenda of the G20 at least. So last year, perhaps because of the tensions and all of that, you did see a slightly tempering of the ambition. It was unfortunate, but it happened. And I think this year, having seen that and working very, very closely with our partners from these developing countries, especially the presidencies which are going to be following after us, which have a high stake in this, we wanted to ensure that while we navigate this space, which was turbulent for sure, but also not reduce the ambition. I think not reduce the ambition also from the perspective of for whom it matters. So I think, you may have heard a lot of senior officials and even our ministers say how G20 during Indian presidency has put development at the heart of it. But I think it's extremely important to also see, where and how this was done from the perspective of the start of these discussions, perhaps on the SDG agenda adoption in 2015 and now. I think for those of you who are familiar with SDG adoption in the 2015, it was very clear that it's a very comprehensive agreement, but we did see withering away of that political will that was important to keeping this agenda comprehensive, how it was to be adopted. And I think we started seeing picking and choosing of the SDGs between the 17 SDGs. I think what was very important, and that's something that we focused on, is we linked development to every aspect of the G20 process. You name finance, you name climate, you name digital, every track of the G20 this year under the Indian presidency has seen development at the heart of it. And we haven't only done a work which is, superficial and grand, but we've actually gone to the depth. We have taken two of the biggest agendas today, which is climate, energy, and built-in development in between that. And I think that we believe is going to have a huge impact, not only because of the fact that everything does have a developmental impact, also because of the fact that what the developing countries are trying to achieve, which is address climate ambition, energy transition, addressing and dealing with uncertainties, growing, while not carbonizing. This has never happened in the history of the world. No country has ever developed in the history of the world without polluting the environment. So you are expecting the developing countries to step up and take that role, which they are doing. And I think we have seen that in terms of the development strategies of a lot of developing countries. But while the international institutions and structures and the frameworks of our cooperation still are really lagging behind. So I think what we really did, and you have to see from the perspective of key messages that have come out of the Leaders' Declaration, whether it is about the focus on human-centric development or globalization or the digital public infrastructure or lifestyles, which speaks to the heart of the demand side of the climate action. It is all about changing the way we see some of these things, and while ensuring that we deliver growth which is not polluting to the environment. So I think from that perspective, this has been really transformational. At the same time, I would have to say that support of the developing countries who helped us, in this has been phenomenal. So that is why we could achieve such a transformative agenda. Just one small point on the consensus bit also coming in. I think it's also important to notice that the times are difficult for a lot of colleagues. Who have been seeing the G20 processes, navigating certain issues which have not been security related, not been political related because of the nature of the grouping, the way it works, which is consensus driven. Seeing how we have come out of it, with a very robust consensus, which we really hope will last, in the next presidency and after that, is about the firm leadership on what is important to be prioritized. So I think that was the key to get such a robust consensus that we really did achieve. And I think that was the role which, if I can say, India played, in terms of not wavering from what is important, and and all other divisions were just somehow coming to the to somewhere a center where it was focused on what is important for the most in need around the world today. And I think we have, even while the nature of G20, having dealt with these issues and having come out of this, will be evolving as the world evolves. All these organizations and bodies have to evolve, but at the same time, ensuring that the focus remains, very specific. And I think that's something that was, extremely important contribution as well. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Enam. Dr. Sinha, climate, of course, has been an integral part of this global approach. So, in your opinion, what are some of the key highlights, and do you see India's efforts facilitating Brazil's presidency? And if I may add a second part to that question, in this journey from India's G20 presidency to Brazil's G20 presidency, there's a stop at COP28. So, do you think India's work can facilitate climate action at COP?
That's a lot of questions. Do I have about an hour to answer this?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay. Okay, let me just re-emphasize what Inam has just said. I think India's G20 presidency, its leadership, I think, has been multifaceted and quite a rare thing to see. And the outcome, as demonstrated through the declaration, I think is unprecedented. We've had 100% consensus on all the 83 paragraphs. And that's quite remarkable, speaks great of India's diplomacy, I think, to negotiate, to do back channel talking, etc. So that, I think, if people look into the history of India's diplomacy in the 75 years, this is indeed an important point, I think, a landmark or watershed, whatever you call it. It also brings into account that India is a true sense global actor, and more importantly, a key influencer, because if you see some of the outcomes and some of the takeaways from the declaration, we do find three elements of this influencing that India has done. One, I think it has democratized and decentralized the whole G20 forum. Remember, largely the entire power equation in the G20 historically has been with the G7 and the North countries. I think India has been able to shift that power, that tilted power towards G7 to a more larger and wholesome group within the G20. I think that the nature of exclusivity that we often see in the G20, dominated by the economically powerful countries, I think has been broken, and there is more inclusive nature of taking decisions, discussing problems, etc. The second element of India's influencing role in the G20 is its ability to leverage its economic strength, being the fifth largest economy in the world and the fastest growing major economy. I think it's done well to leverage that strength, to show to the world that despite all challenges, despite all difficulties, it still remains, to quote, the bright spot in the economic landscape. The third element, before I come to the takeaways, is I think it's ideation. I think India's ideas, bringing in sort of quick thinking, new approaches to dealing with global challenges, I think is quite remarkable. Look at some of the takeaways here. It's trying to bring in not only a global south perspective, which is so very important, but it's also trying to build up a north-south bridge through the green sort of climate fund backed initiative that it has done. It is also trying to realign producers and consumers in the energy market. Right? It's bringing in ideas of the voice. It's brought in the African Union into the G20. So I think these are elements as students and as observers I think we should really focus on. Why has India been able to turn this G20 into a landmark sort of outcome? And I would say that no other country, given the political sort of difficulties and the fissures and the economic downturn, I don't think any country would have brought this declaration the way India has. So it's something really to study. Now quickly on the takeaways, I think the declaration has largely and quite correctly focused on sustainable development goals. We are midway now to 2030. It has focused on climate action. I think it is understood that there is climate change, but the actions are very important. And I think the three the takeaways have been to sort of upgrade your entire renewable energy by 2030, upscale it with ambitious goal, and so that you would find carbon emission falling down dramatically by 2030, and by 2035 it is expected that if you triple the renewable energy sources, the carbon emission will obviously come down by 60% by 2035. That's quite remarkable. Also doubling the global rate of energy efficiency in this decade, from now to 2030, with what happened in the earlier decade, 2010 to 2020, and I think that brings in again a very global perspective. One important takeaway, which is often missed in this age of great consumption and consumerism and market-driven attraction, is the whole idea of sustainable consumption. I think that is a strong emphasis in the report, in the declaration, coming through what the Prime Minister has stated: lifestyle for environment. I think it's a wonderful idea given to the world to reflect upon. Now, a very simple example. An average American's carbon footprint is about 42 times more than an Indian average person. And India's population size is 4 times more than the United States. So if you 42 into 4, it comes to 170 times more is the average consumption in America than what it is in India. So when you hear the whole world talking about that India needs to cut down its emissions, doesn't make a difference. India only emits 7% of the overall global emissions. So even if India brings it down to 6 and 5, it doesn't really matter. What matters is 80% of the world which is over-consuming, they need to reduce their consumption. So one of the gravest errors in this whole climate debate and sustainable development goal is climate injustice. And I think India cannot, and many of the developing countries cannot really see this happening. And therefore it brings me to the question of what happens in COP28. Now, COP28 is going to be played at a very different level. Don't expect the G20 declaration to have any sort of, applause there, because they work in different blocks and they work in different negotiation streams. But I think two elements will be important. One would be the finances, and I think that is now the driver to attaining many of your sustainable development goals and many of your climate actions and initiatives. So that will be discussed more. The other thing is that the principles of the CBDR, which is a long-standing principle that India has, common but differentiated responsibility, respective capability, and your national understanding of what energy to use. All these will play an important role there. And I think the one element that we should be careful and we should strongly sort of talk about is not really phasing out coal, but gradually and slowly phasing down coal. Of course, we've debated it earlier in the Glasgow COP, but I think we have to re-emphasize on the coal, because I think the Western world will still, sort of clamp down on India on its coal take. And I think we have, a certain ambition. We, of course, do not say that we continue with coal, but I think it does, for the time being, fit into our overall objective of attaining energy independence by 2047 and achieving net carbon zero emission by 2070. So these are some elements in the COP28, but it will be very different from what the G20 declaration is.
Thank you, Dr. Sinha. Speaking of ambition, Dr. Chaudhary, another major priority for India's presidency was the push for digital public infrastructure. So what is your assessment of the same? And beyond the G20, what role do you think India should adopt? What is the potential of the India stack?
Okay, thanks, Richa. Thanks to Indrani and Anta for kind of having us. Just wanted to kind of just say, thanks to Ms. Gambhir and the entire G20 team. I mean, it's been an incredible effort. It's not the easiest of times geopolitically or otherwise. So, even beyond the consensus, frankly, and I'll be honest, I'm more concerned about the ministerial outcomes than the leaders' declaration. I think the leaders' declaration is fine, but it's important. But the consensus that was reached in each of those ministerial kind of outcome meetings is quite incredible. So just a big congratulations. Look, on DPI, just a couple of points, right? One is, it's worth keeping in mind that this time last year, there was no terminology called DPI. It didn't exist, right? What we had essentially is a world where we had various countries and we had largely companies that essentially build what you might call technology features for development and inclusion, right? So it could be payments, it could be ID, it could be a range of other solutions, easier passporting, travel, so on and so forth. But the theory was pretty simple, right? The theory was essentially, till about 15 or 20 years ago, is that you create these vertical structures, largely what we call vendor-based structures, which are also vendor-locked structures, right? And you speak to one particular technology solution, right? You want ID, I'll give you ID. But that solution doesn't talk to anything else, right? So whether it's a company or whether it's a government, that was essentially what was built out, and it did well, right? In terms of thinking about what it could do to bring large parts of the world into banking, into financial inclusion, so on and so forth, right? That model started turning on its head with India, largely. So, India kind of created Aadhaar in 2009, and not only India, by the way. Countries like Singapore, Estonia, India, these are all trailblazers when it comes to DPI, right? India is kind of, I think, one of the best empirical cases, because what we've done is at population scale, right? Estonia does it for less than 2 million people. We do it for like 1.4, 1.5 billion people, and there is a difference there. So essentially, we've also built tech features, but in the G20, I think, and it'll be maybe interesting to get Ms. Gambhir off the record to talk about how this actually came about. But some decision was taken to say is that, look, we need a framework, right? It's a fragmented world. There's a lot of tech features being built out. We need some kind of a framework in order to define what we will begin to call digital public infrastructure. That was only in November of 2022. Fast forward 9 months to August of 2023, you had two sets of consensus out of the G20 process. One is out of what's called the Sherpa track, where the Digital Economy Working Group came up with about a sort of 10-page document, which has 100% consensus on number one, what is DPI, right? Number two, what are the principles that entail DPI, right? So the argument was that unlike the vendor lock models, DPI should be open, should be based on open APIs, should be interoperable, and there are a whole range of principles, right? That's one. Similarly, in the finance track, we had an even larger document that came out in something called the GPFI, which is the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion. And that's an 80-page document. So think about it. So 20 jurisdictions agreed to an 80-page document basically detailing out DPI. So DWG told you what DPI was, which has never happened before. It is the first multilateral framework for DPI in the world. The GPFI told you how to do it, right? So you actually had this very nice two sets of documents, and documents on their own mean little. It's the process that leads to the document that means quite a bit. And I can tell you is that, look, even in February or March, if you walked into the, this is on the record, but I'll try and be, if you walked into the US State Department or parts of the UK system, nobody knew what DPI was. And frankly, that wasn't their fault. Look, the concept and the grammar and the syntax of DPI evolved, right? But people basically took the view that, hey, listen, it's just way too early to get a multilateral consensus on something called digital public infrastructure. Then slowly people started understanding what this stuff can actually do, that it can actually deliver, Ms. Gambhir and Uttam talked about SDGs. Fact is, it became very clear to countries, there is no way that you can reach your 2030 SDG goals without DPI. It's impossible, right? What DPI can do essentially in a period of 6 or 7 years, ordinarily and in analog methods will take you about, at the very least, 2.5 to 3 decades, right? And there the India case study becomes important, right? As does other parts of the world, but again, India has population scale, right? The minute this started clicking, so the minute you had German ministers coming down, going to Pune, visiting Bengaluru, and basically seeing this stuff, right? Buy a coconut on a QR code, right? Some of that is theatrics, but some of that is real. Like they realize that, in the sense that if this can happen in India, right, it can happen in other parts of the world. So slowly what started developing is not so much an India model, I'll say. What developed was a DPI model, right? So this is a truly global vision, right? So we weren't selling India through each of the tracks, let's be very clear. India was the model through which we created the global DPI framework, right? As was injections from Singapore, Estonia, Philippines, Thailand, and so on and so forth. And I think that leadership in itself is quite something else, right? So if you ask me the question, for me, I'll be honest, I take all the points and I'm not being competitive, but for me, the single most lasting effect of this G20 presidency will be the DPI framework. Why do I say that? Go to any global north country, the money bags, right? Everybody today is saying, how do we do DPI in 100 countries? How do we do DPI in 50 countries? How do we do the rate of financial inclusion in parts of Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Oceania, big island states, the way India, Singapore, and others have done it, right? That energy and momentum didn't even exist, leave alone 9 months ago, but even say 4 months ago, right? Now it's a policy objective, right? So now whether it's USAID, FCDO, GIZ in Germany, just name it. People now want to find meaning in this madness. So which takes me to the second question of where do you take this forward? I think one is, there is no bridge that is more ripe between the Indian and the Brazilian presidency than DPI, in my view. And I don't know much about climate, frankly, and I'm sure there is lots there as well, right? Why? Because Brazil has one of the finest DPIs in the universe, right? PIX is one of the best payment systems. We have capability, we have technical expertise, we have vision, so do they, right? So there is a kind of a, made in heaven kind of situation over here between the two. The key is there enough political impetus on our side, as well as on the Brazilian side, to actually construct this and take it forward? And I'll leave a question mark there, because I don't know, right? Second, my hope is that out of this G20 presidency, we have an institutional outcome. I don't see any other institutional outcome. And institutional outcomes out of the G20 over the last 15 years has been very difficult, right? DPI could be an institutional outcome, right? Even if you go modest, start with creating something like a multi-stakeholder organization. You need a home for DPI. We have countries from Togo to Tonga to Fiji to Nauru Countries with a population, by the way, of 11,000 people, 20,000 people, okay, basically say, how do we access this? They need a home to go to. And that home has to be, in my view, an Indian-led home, but has to be global. You have to do this globally, right? India Stack matters, but it's not just a question of selling India Stack to everybody. We have to work with builders, we have to work with technicians, we have to think of different ways to deploy this. How are you going to deploy DPI to 100 countries? In India itself, it took a huge deal to get this going. Keep that in mind. So my hope is, what's the kind of outcome? One, Brazil presidency, and two, we create some kind of a home. Create modestly, create it even in an academic department, create in a university, place the structure, call it a secretariat if you want to, don't call it, it doesn't matter. But become the home where builders from around the world can come on the demand side, which is all 100 countries who want this, and the supply side, which is about 10 or 15 countries that can build this.
Thank you, Dr. Chaudhary. Just to follow up on that, you spoke of DPI deployment, right? So within the G20 framework, do you identify any countries that can sort of partner with India to take this forward?
So I think lots. I mean, I don't think, look, deployments are it's difficult.
Yeah.
It's not easy to, signing MOUs are hard, but deploying this stuff is much harder, okay? There are a lot of considerations. There's a tried and tested method by which you deploy DPI. Usual stuff, right? You give a line of credit to a country, the country puts out an RFP, you have a procurement process, and everybody for some reason in today's age wants data centers of their own, you want networks of your own, you want switches of your own, etc. I'll be honest, in some of the work we've been doing, it's a pretty outdated way of doing digital transformation, right? There are other ways that we can do it, but we can't do it alone, right? There are cloud-based, innovative, disruptive ways, and there's one country who can prove the case, it's India, but we need to work with builders across the world. There are a lot of other countries who we've also signed bilateral agreements with, by the way. I mean, one of the things that the government did in its wisdom was that as it pushed the DPI agenda through the G20 process, in order to get real momentum, it signed bilateral agreements and joint statements with the US, with the EU under the EU-India TTC and France. Those have very thick paragraphs on DPI. So it's a policy imperative on both sides. So you do have countries that are now knocking on your doors. And I come to the question that we have to find ways to work with those countries now, right?
Thank you. If I were to broaden the context a little bit, both DPI and climate are incredibly relevant to the inclusion of a new actor, new member into the G20, which is of course the African Union. I think while everybody in this room recognizes the importance of their inclusion, how do you think that India and the African Union can cooperate more effectively within the framework?
Thank you for this question. So I think, African Union entry into the G20, which, as a colleague here was mentioning, in a grouping which was otherwise, maybe till some years ago was seen as an elite group, group of rich countries, and I think that's a reflection, and I must say, the way Prime Minister led that process and the way we did receive a lot of support from a lot of countries. It was, adopted without, much opposition, and what has also brought to the fore the recognition of the idea that it is the agenda of the Global South, which I think this represents very much, to be taken up at all forums, which is actually going to also lead to solution of the bigger agendas of the world, and I'll speak to that. And it's in the context of cooperation with African Union. Of course, now it's part of this important grouping, and we with like other countries will also be working with them very closely. But I think what African Union's priorities, their issues, and the way we took up this presidency, starting with the Voice of Global South Summit represents. I mean, you look at, for example, we spoke of climate and DPI. There are many other issues. There's energy transition. There are issues relating to poverty alleviation, inequality. There are hot issues of discussion. I think in terms of the solutions that are coming out to some of these challenges. Rudra spoke about the DPI aspect, and I think, of course, we all know the discussions on the word public, right? What did it mean? Why is it important? Was such a intense conversation with a lot of countries on the table. The discussion, for example, on the lifestyle initiative, where people said, okay, it's an individual-driven initiative. How is it going to impact such a big climate agenda? But I think underscoring some of these important discussions is the way to really reframe the way we look at these things. So you look at, for example, the lifestyle initiative. Colleague here was also mentioning about the carbon emissions discussion and the studies that have gone. There have been more and more studies coming out now, which actually suggest that the demand side measures are a key component of the emission reduction, but we don't discuss that when it comes to the international fora, because some people maybe don't want to focus on their consumption as much. Some people do not know how to do it. So imagine a solution or a suggested approach to that coming from a developing country in a world where consumption is seen as the primary growth model. I mean, we don't have models which are not based on consumption, which also provide growth. So I think in that space, speaking of the fact that not only we are going to reduce our consumption, all the world should, I think is extremely visionary, and I think it's extremely reflective of also the idea that it is not possible to achieve our global, agendas without that. Uzo spoke about how it is not possible to achieve, SDGs without the digital public infrastructure, public being a very important part of that, because that is exactly what reflects the intention behind, bringing in multiple stakeholders and creating the almost an innovation in the partnership models themselves, right? That's what I think in India we saw. The kind of partnerships that were coming just by providing some of this infrastructure in the public domain. So I think solutions of the global issues given by the global south approach to these things is the way to go. So for us, the way we see this is only not going to be important for the global south issues, which are, yes, very basic, but also very broad. And I think, I can sort of circle this point by speaking about consensus again, right? Like the consensus language achieved in Indian presidency leaders' declaration is indeed a message for peace. It is a true sort of, if you look at that, it is about how do you, what are the various components of what is important in this discussion. So I think again, I think it is important to see that focusing on these, which our Prime Minister calls human-centric approaches to globalization, to climate action, to development, is not only going to be important for a large part of humanity, which does reside in the global south, but also for the more important complex global agendas that we spoke to. So I'll stop.
Thank you. Dr. Sinha, another major highlight was the launch of the Global Biofuels Alliance and the push for green hydrogen. So how do you evaluate the impact of these initiatives on global energy transition?
Well, both are critically important for energy transition. And I think it's appropriate that the continuation of the G20 declaration, the baton exchange now goes to Brazil, as Brazil and India are both key producers of biofuel and consumers of biofuel. And therefore it's not surprising to see the Global Biofuel Alliance, three principal actors, the United States, Brazil, and India, sort of initiating the whole thing. It is also to be noted that in the last 7 to 8 years of Prime Minister Modi, I think India has initiated a lot of similar global alliances and global agenda, starting with the International Solar Alliance in 2015, then the coalition of disaster resilient infrastructure in 2019, followed by a more specific alliance on infrastructure for the small islands in 2022, LIFE. And I think in many sense, as I said earlier in my remarks, that India is initiating a lot of things, looking at challenges and trying to bring together what is called collective action And I think no wonder India is the poster boy of international relations. Very basic, fundamental outlook of international relations. Collective action, cooperation, finding, middle grounds. So these are elements that have been brought into our diplomacy, and therefore, I reinstate this fact that India is a very prime principal influencer. But just a quick on the Brazil thing, I think it's the G20 leadership has been a kind of a relay, 4 into 100 meter or 4 into 400 meters. Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. The global South representation in the G20, I think, is significant. And therefore, for me, the G20 document doesn't just end with the New Delhi Declaration. It is a continuation from South Africa, then to from Brazil, and then to South Africa. And remember, India, Brazil, South Africa are IPSA Dialogue Forum members. So this trilateral arrangement here. So we have multilateral, small grouping, minilaterals, and trilateral way of looking. So we have to exploit and leverage all platforms that we can in this thing. I think Brazil is a perfect fit here. President Lula da Silva complements very well, I think, Indian Prime Minister Modi. In his earlier term, 2002 to 2010, he had used the digital platform in bringing forth numerous welfare schemes to the public. So I think Brazil is very familiar with digitalization, which will be one element of carrying forward the G20 declaration from India. I think another element would be focusing on food and energy security. And I said this alliance, the Biofuel Alliance, will be very, very helpful. And let's not forget, Lula himself is, if you look at his history, he's a trade unionist. He has a coalition government which is left to the center. He will raise his voice in the international forum, which is, naturally very elitist and exclusive, and that voice will resonate with India's vision of a global governance, which is far more equitable and far more inclusive. And I think this convergence, I think, is very important, and therefore the next year will be as equally important as the New Delhi Declaration, as far as I'm concerned. I think India's entire, just to answer very quickly on the Biofuel Alliance and the hydrogen, the green hydrogen work plan, I think all this is very simply to state that we have net zero carbon emission target 2070. We want to be, as I said, be independent, energy independent by 2047. For us, I think it is also equally important that we reduce our dependency on foreign fossil fuel. Right? And if you look at the foreign import bill, it is almost 9 billion a year. And that is also equally important because it helps us to attain a certain independence, certain self-sustainability, and all this searching for new sources and new resources is part of the larger energy matrix that we are sort of looking at. And therefore in that, and as I said, coal will be equally important, at least for a short time period, at least up till 2040. So it's not about really phasing out coal, it's about peaking. We need to peak our production in coal so that we attain our levels of green transition and achieve our net zero carbon emission target.
Thank you. Since we're trying to include as many topics as we can within the little time we have, Dr. Chaudhary, the responsible use of AI was a significant focus as well during the presidency. So do you see any convergences or global agreements on AI regulation around the world? And what should India's cybersecurity priorities be going forward?
Okay, so cybersecurity I can't answer to. I don't work on cybersecurity. I barely work on AI. But my sense on the G20 side is that I'm not quite sure that AI was a central focus of the G20 presidency. And that's primarily because we're in a very fragmented place right now when it comes to AI regulation. I think the G20 para, in my own sense, if I read the para, just from the para, was shaped to some extent by the activities of the G7, right? Where Japan has taken a real kind of push on AI. But separately, I'll just say is that, I think these multilateral paragraphs actually do matter. They keep a conversation going. India will host what's known as the GPAI, which is the Global Partnership of Artificial Intelligence. It's a summit that we chair. It goes around like round robins. We chair it, and we'll be running the summit in the middle of December, where hopefully there'll be some discussions about can you create a kind of a compact for AI. But there I'll just kind of leave you with one thought, right? And my limited understanding of AI, everyone's looking at harms, everyone's looking at safety, rules, regulations. I'll just leave a lot of students in this room. Is that the critical question for India? Right? Of course it is to a certain extent. How companies use your data, what are the biases, what are the prejudices, those are very important, right? But for question for India, and I think for large parts of the global south, is actually access to AI, which is compute, which is hardware, right? And frankly, we're at a place where we don't have that kind of hardware today to be able to even build one foundational model or one LLM with an Indian context. So should the focus be on kind of working on pushing and taking the leadership on a global compact on safeguards? I don't think so. There are others who are doing it. Our companies and organizations, your NASCOM, CII, they'll do this. They'll create some code of conduct and all, which is fine. But nationally, I would say is that the focus needs to be on compute. Because without compute, you're not going to get context. Without context, you're not going to get that self-reliance. And that's just a fact of AI.
Thank you. We will now open the floor to questions. Please raise your hand and keep your questions brief. Please.
Good evening to all the respected dignitaries present here. Sir, my question is to Uttam Kumar sir. So, overcoming the north-south divide is definitely one of the major hurdles in facing the environmental protection regime. As the North world has just over 20% of the world population but consumes 80% of the world energy. And on the other hand, the South world is still struggling with to provide the basic amenities or needs for its population. So my question is, how developing countries such as India should deal with this injustice? And as also Ina ma'am said, that no country has developed without polluting the environment. So sir,
Okay, so we'll take two more questions and then if you could please answer. Anybody else? Please.
Good afternoon to the guys. This is Marchilan from RTC of International Studies. So I have two questions. My first question is to.
Can you please limit that to one?
So my question is to Ina ma'am. What is your take on India's G20 presidency towards enhancing economic and social empowerment of green finance and inclusivity towards more of a humanitarian coordination? Coordination.
We'll take one more. Please.
My question is from Dr. Sinha, sir. So, as you say that India has taken many steps to fight this climate change, and I agree that India is doing beyond its capacity to do the same. But sir, don't you think there is need to create a sense of urgency in that? Like, as we say that India is only third largest producer of carbon. Why can't we say that India is third largest producer of carbon? Because we are facing the want of climate change at our home, whether it is Sikkim flood, whether it is Uttarakhand, whether it is Himachal Pradesh. So I just want to know.
Thank you. Dr. Sinha.
Okay. Okay, the first question on the north-south divide. Never the twain shall meet. I think the north-south will meet because this is one world. Of course, there's been narratives built up, historical narratives in the past, the whole pattern of industrialization and then the historical emission that happened. Remember the problems we face today in terms of global warming and climate change is because of the historical accumulation of 80% of the carbon in the atmosphere. So there is a historical hurt, there is a historical context. But I think the developing country over the last decade or so have effectively made that point. The point now is to come to the table and discuss how to meet these challenges because this is a global challenge and it requires solutions at various levels. And I think the idea in the North-South debate is, of course, one would be the defining element now would, of course, be the finances. Who will pay for these issues and to achieve the goals ahead? Of course, the developed countries, the North, have made pledges, but pledges are often ignored. I think it is time that they really did contribute, for example, to the climate fund, 100 billion a year, which they have lagged behind. And I think from the developing perspective, the voice of the South here will have to keep reminding them of that in the COP meetings. The second would be, of course, on the technology transfer. And that is, again, an element where both the North and the South can meet. But importantly, for the global South, it is also important to build their own internal capabilities and capacities and not get too carried away by exported technologies, which can, in many sense, backfire. So there's enough space in the South, global South, to look at their own internal capacity and capability, their own indigenous knowledge that can push them in a certain rightful direction. So I think there are greater convergences now in the North-South debate on climate change, and we'll see more action-oriented approaches between these two rather than divergences in the future. So I'm a little more hopeful in that sense. Sense of urgency, as you said, yes, for us in South Asia, India in South Asia, there is a climate urgency. In fact, there is climate emergency, I would say. If you look at the sort of climate-related disasters that is happening, and I think this is worrying because in the next 10 years, South Asia is going to witness enormous infrastructure development in terms of roads being built, in terms of ports being built, in terms of metro lines, etc. And these are going to be more impacted by hydrometeorological disasters, anything that is related to rainfall, abrupt change in weather, etc. So I think that is a sense of urgency for us. You said India is the third emitter in absolute terms. I think we should always say in per capita terms. We are 129 in the list. So it is how you look at it. India will require energy, not less of it, more of it in the next 15 years. It is going to grow at almost 3% annually, and it's going to be the largest user of energy in the next 10 years. So we do need energy, we need varied resources, but we have to also look at terms of how we develop, that is very important. It's not the speed of development as much as it's the quality of development that is important. And that quality of development would require greater governance, more governmentality, which links the local communities to the state and the state to the center and the center to the region. I think that is far more important when you think about development and linking development to climate change.
Thank you. Ina?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I think on the issue of finance, and I would basically speak a little bit broadly than just limiting it to green finance, because for many global agendas, finance is critical. And as Uttamji was saying, so I think on the climate issues, or energy transition or development, when you look at some of these really global agendas, and you look at the agenda of G20, it is very clear that because these agendas are transnational, they, despite having a certain history of how the emissions happened, it is quite possible that the developing countries, as you said, would be facing the brunt more, right? Or at least in a disproportionate manner. They're already doing that. So I think we are dealing with global, truly global agendas. And we're trying really hard to catch up in terms of our cooperation, in terms of whether we mobilize finance, technology, and all of that, in a timely manner. And frankly, on some of these resource generation, the world is very, very much lagging behind. So there has been, and I think, it's just like any other project. The international agendas are not very different from how any team, small team does its work. Trust is important. Fulfilling your promises is important because that builds trust. And I think when that doesn't happen, and the trust withers away, or the sense of cooperation or coming together, goes away, it affects the outcomes. Or if the outcomes, are not going to have a sustained impact on the ground, there will be suffering. So I think if you look at some of these agendas, it's not only about looking at the historical emission side for the argument's sake of it, but look at it, as I said, from a developing country perspective, having to do not 5 but 10 agendas at the same time, with almost no finances coming or technology. So it's really a tall task, and within that space, I think there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of finances, or the resources to be coming along, and that has really been the work of our presidency, and also the Indonesian presidency spoke to it, and we are certain Brazilian and the South African presidency will take that up in terms of really speaking about the means. And these discussions should not be seen from the perspective of this side versus the other. Even though when there is no trust, it is easy to polarize some of these discussions, because when you say finance not coming, there are experts in the developing countries who will say, oh, because you don't want us to develop, and that's why you're not fulfilling your promises, and we didn't do it. And I think all of these on the ground really do not make as much of a difference as really progress forward. So I think on some of those issues we have pushed the agenda forward by linking the human-centric development side to each and every of the global agenda, as I said before. On the finance side, and I'm no expert, so I cannot speak more on more detail to that. But I think it's very clear also, if you see the institutional framework discussions that have happened in the finance track, or how they are covered in other relevant Sherpa tracks, development, climate, energy, so to say. I think the recognition that our institutions are not doing enough, and the fact that they need a paradigm shift in terms of how they see some of these interlinkages. I mean, today, if you are trying to do energy transition in any country, it has impact on labor, it has impact on other industries, the vested interests. How do you manage disruptions? And without that, just changing a particular resource from one fuel to another is not going to have an impact unless you actually take care of the disruptions that it's going to create. So I think looking at it from that perspective has really not been, I can say, the important focus of some of the institutions who are dealing with it. And I think, we created them 75 years ago, so we know what the focus at that time was, and we have shifted the focus now to much more human-centric versus economy-only sort of discussion. That's what Prime Minister spoke about in his remarks in the Saudi, during the Saudi summit of the G20. And I think while it is interesting that while a large part of countries around the world, especially in the global south, understand this, the institutions are still to catch up. And I think that also reflects how some of the international cooperation framework are structured, which is where the discussions on injustice really come in. Because it is, again, as I said, it's not a sake of argument. You see that in the way international cooperation works and the frameworks work. Who has more say perhaps beyond their current capabilities and current stakes and things like that, and whether we should see some of these discussions from a stakeholder, financial stakeholder perspective, or we should start seeing development not as a grant but as an investment, really, in the future of societies which are much more resilient to deal with the kind of challenges that we have faced. So I think it is, truly a paradigm shift discussions that we are discussing, and I think we do believe that there has been some, moving forward of that conversation that has happened during the Indian presidency, and will be taken forward by other IPSA colleagues, from Brazil and South Africa. Thanks.
So we'll take 2 more questions. Vidhu?
You take it.
Go ahead.
Mine was for Secretary. I was kind of wondering, with this G20 and the way it's gone, there is a November virtual session that's coming up with regards to the global south. So how do you see that playing up? Do you see some of the continuities in terms of India's G20 priorities, and basically what do you think, or I guess you would know, but could you tell us what some of them would be?
Thank you. We'll take one more. Please.
Greetings everyone, I'm Neeti Agrawal and Ananta has been ELF fellow. So coming to the question, my question is from Inam ma'am. So ma'am, considering that the Prime Minister has been focusing a lot on 100% consensus and being a part of the Y20 and L20 Secretariat myself, I've seen at times how hard it is to come to a consensus. So which were the key issues that you think took the most effort to come on a consensus? Thank you.
Thank you. I think I don't have enough time to answer, that question, but I'll just try and attempt a little bit, elaborating on what I said earlier. On the question of the virtual summit, just very briefly, since India had its summit slightly early, towards the couple of months ahead of the end of the presidency, and since during the G20 summit in September, very intense discussions that are preceding that in terms of finalizing the declaration, and it almost every time comes together at the nth moment. I think there was a lot of there was a need felt, especially in the view of a lot of suggestions and a lot of ideas coming from the leaders themselves as they all attended the G20 summit, and really sort of adopted such an ambitious declaration, because I think that's also extremely important, because a lot of times these groupings do at the leaders level say, we're going to do this, and there is of course a momentum, but then how do you actually take it forward is an important discussion. So I think in terms of that, the virtual summit is going to be an opportunity to see some of this, and also discuss the various suggestions that the Prime Minister, the other leaders had given. How do we, from here on, see that going forward? In terms of the consensus, I think, as we have seen the complexity of the issues, a real division on some of these, core global agendas as they're coming forward, it'll be hard to, sort of identify, but for example, if you were to see the climate and the energy ministerial, and I think that's something that is out there in the public domain. Those were the only two ministerials which did not produce 100% consensus on the thematic issues. Every other ministerial achieved, only the geopolitical part, which we all understand was not agreed, but everything else was agreed. So these are definitely, two of the major global agendas, very relevant for people, not only in terms of the impact, but the repercussions of, some of these discussions. So I think these definitely produce very intense discussion, and I think a lot of, changes in a turbulent world always mean, more and more of sort of honest consultations between colleagues. And I think there, I must say, the radar focus that we kept on what was important in terms of what G20 can do versus what it can't do, whether it's about looking at the finer climate details, which are discussed at COP, political issues, which is not really G20's mandate. That is really where, what was the strategy that helped us, to move forward on even climate and energy. Because finally, in the Leaders' Declaration, we have 100% consensus there too. So I'll stop there.
I'm okay, but make sure it's brief. We will have to wrap up now. And just after you, if there's anybody on this side, we'll take the last two questions very brief. Okay, sure.
So this question is to the common dais. What are your expectations from Brazil's G20 presidency with respect to the future of global governance, with a more of multilateral initiatives in regards to sustainable development through global economic cooperation?
Thanks. Please.
Greetings to the panel. My name is Shreya and I'm from Amity Institute of International Studies. My question is, we see the hype of technology in the coming recent years. And I want to ask, what future do you see with the integration of technology with the sustainable development goals, as well as the climate change in the upcoming future and the expectations from it?
Thank you. Very briefly, if you could answer that, please, Enam and Dr. Sinha.
On Brazil, I hope and to see a sustained momentum that was built by India, and I do feel it will be. I think one of the reasons in geopolitical terms is that Brazil, like India, will maintain a certain neutrality, and that I think will help it to muster all these important elements of the New Delhi Declaration and carry it forward.
Yes.
Just very briefly, I think we, for example, as I mentioned before, worked very closely with the Brazilian, Indonesian, South African colleagues on all agendas, and they were co-chairs of many of our working group sessions and things like that. So the agenda that we are bringing up, of course, and then we do know that Brazil is going to be very specifically focusing, at least in the development realm, on poverty alleviation, all of that. Really fits in terms of the more larger, bigger picture direction, and then getting into the specifics, right, and producing tangible results for people. So I think there's a lot of sort of coordination that is happening already, within the developing country groups, owing to just what the G20 has come out of, and how it's been. So there's a lot of hope there.
Dr. Chaudhary, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think just one is, I think, which we didn't discuss here, but I think the agenda on reforming multilateral banks, I actually think that's really important. And I think the presidency in India kind of gave a massive fillip to that process. So today we have a president of the World Bank who openly says is that this is an important priority. Hopefully that will continue. I think it will continue down the Brazilian presidency and the South African one. And then the fact that these three are held by the Global South does matter. Just on the question of tech and integration, and I don't know how to. So let me just ask. I mean, I know, but just think about this way: is I'm guessing 90% of this room doesn't know what DPI is, right? So my hope, rather than look outside, frankly, there's a lot that will be done outside, is that as much as we focus on the G20 looking out, that now kind of we start focusing in basically getting people to understand what DPI can actually do, right, from an integration perspective. But I can tell you one thing globally, and I think this is where the presidency has played a very important role. It has changed imaginations in different parts of the world and in locations, especially, for the lack of a better term, the global north, right? Which perhaps did not fully appreciate what tech could actually do for societies, for inclusion, for inclusive finance, right? And that drive has been structured, constructed with very clear outcomes of this presidency. And I think you've created now a marketplace of ideas. And the next move is you have to do your bit now to actually keep up. Because now we're not going to be the only people in town building this stuff, constructing this stuff, or creating that grammar. You've opened this box, which I think is fantastic. I very much hope that we lead on this box. Because if we don't, someone else will.
I'm sure you all found this discussion very insightful. Please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you and good evening. We hope to see you for one of our public sessions soon. Thank you.